Morning class, I'm back in the bunker, and today we've got an interesting and important discussion today that applies to what is going on currently with the coronavirus shutdown, and as to whether or not churches should or should not legally, or I should say governments can or cannot legally keep churches from meeting, and that's an interesting thing. But before we even discuss that, there is a legal context and a history of how we might approach such a thing. And so we're going to start some time ago with Sherbert versus Werner, a case where a Seventh-day Adventist was working at a textile factory, and she did not want to work on Saturdays because she's a Seventh-day Adventist, and in doing so, that would violate her religious belief that she cannot work on the Sabbath, which is Saturday. And so what ended up happening is she quit her job in order to practice her religious worship on Sabbath, because they were not going to allow her the day off. And then she went and she filed for unemployment, and she's denied. Why is she denied? Well, because unemployment insurance requires that you are laid off for a legitimate or less than legitimate reason. If you're fired for cause, you're also denied unemployment. But in this case, she quit, and so because she quit, Bear, come here. So in this case, she quit, and because she quit, and in this case, because she quit, she was no. In this case, she quit, and because she quit, she was ineligible for unemployment. But of course, she quit because of her religious beliefs conflicted. And so what she did is they sent her to go to court. The lower courts held the decision that she was ineligible, and then it gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturns this, and you get the Sherbert test. Now, the Sherbert test says that if there is a law or ordinance of some sort, federal or otherwise, that the government must show a compelling state interest to place a burden on the religious believer. That is, it's kind of like if you're charged with a crime, it's the government's burden to prove that you did it. Well, when you create legislation that's going to be neutral in this case, that's going to apply to everybody, and it somehow is going to inadvertently affect religious believers and their actions, you have to show that there is good reason to create such legislation and require these religious citizens to act in such a way. That is, there's a real good, it's compelling. That's a compelling reason. And then there's a second step to this, is that even when you do so, you have to do it in the least restrictive way. All right? That you can't just, you go, well, that's it. And you have to do it to make sure you are trying to at least make it the least restrictive towards those who it will affect. Okay. Now, of course, this will eventually find its way to the court again. This Sherbert test, and it does so in the Employment Division versus Smith test. Now, Smith and a buddy of his, they were counselors. They were counselors and for drug counselors, that is, rehab. They were drug rehab counselors, and they went out and they partook in a Native American religious rite, and in doing so, they took peyote, and peyote is a hallucinogenic drug. It is a controlled substance. It is a crime to do this drug recreationally. And so what ends up happening is they get fired from their job as drug rehab counselors, and they go to get some unemployment. Now they didn't quit like Sherbert, but they got fired. So in that case, you go, okay, well that's okay. Step. Now in the Sherbert versus Werner case, they established the Sherbert test, and so we're going to end up applying this to the employment division versus Smith. And so these two have smoked peyote, which is a controlled substance. They get fired. They go to apply for unemployment. They get denied because they were fired for cause. And so they take this to court. It ends up being the case where the court does not apply the Sherbert test, because in this case there is a law, a general law, that seems to have some kind of compelling interest, but they reject that. The court rejects this, that they need to prove that these guys shouldn't take peyote as part of their religious practice. Okay, and the court rules, oh, that doesn't matter. The Sherbert test doesn't count here. And so these two guys, they do not end up getting their unemployment. So they lose the case. And so what ends up happening is there's this outcry from religious groups, and a bipartisan Congress during a time when Bill Clinton was being impeached actually comes together and creates the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. All right, and that's known as RFRA, RFRA. So whenever you see that, that's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And that was a response to this case, and it suggested that they needed to do a couple things. One, they needed to go back to restore the burden of the government to show a compelling state interest in creating laws that will burden religious citizens. And it will, too, require them again to make the least restrictive means to further that interest. That is, that they will use the least restrictive ways. And this was to restore the Sherbert test. So what ends up happening with the Sherbert, not the Sherbert test, but RFRA, is eventually the Supreme Court is going to find it unconstitutional when it comes to state laws that may have a general interest that affects religious citizens. But when it comes to federal laws, RFRA still works. Now this case is going to end up being used, RFRA that is going to be used in Hobby Lobby versus Burwell. And this is where we start to ask the questions, do corporations have the same rights as persons when it comes to religious beliefs? And so, for example, Hobby Lobby, which is a religious organization, or at least the people who own that corporation are religious. They believe certain things about abortion, for one, and they believe certain things about birth control. And so their Christian beliefs dictate that they don't want to provide insurance or money that goes towards abortions. And so what ended up happening is during the Affordable Care Act, certain entities, our school was required, it was one of them, and was required to provide health insurance that would include certain reproductive health care. And so these groups, they sued, and they rested on RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and said, look, the government needs to show a compelling state interest as to why these entities need to provide this birth control or abortive procedures insurance that might cover that for their employees. Especially, for example, in many cases, one of the problems is in many cases the government is requiring like churches to provide this insurance where the people in the church would agree with the church and wouldn't use it in the first place. So, and then the second part was the least restrictive part. And so when they did it, they didn't apply it in the least restrictive manner. They said you're going to do it or else. And so this goes to court, and it ends up being a victory for the religious groups in this case. So in this case, it showed that the government required a compelling state interest to force these entities, these corporations, to comply with certain laws with which they would have violated their religious beliefs, the beliefs of the owners at least, or say the regents and professors and administration of the schools. And so these entities ended up winning the day. The government couldn't show a compelling state interest to force this upon them, and thus they were not forced to do so. And so this is going to apply right now to what's going on with the coronavirus. You say, well, we're asking people to stay at home, the government is, that is. And they're saying there's a mandate, a stay-at-home order. And football games are canceled, baseball, basketball, plays, large gathering, restaurants are closed, bars are closed. And then they say, well, churches need to close too. Okay. The goal here is for the government is to shut down anything that is non-essential. So the churches, many churches say, well, hey, we beg to differ on this. We're not going to close our doors. And that the government needs to show a compelling state interest as to why this stay-at-home order would apply to us. Now, in my opinion, I think it's clear. You got two questions. You got the moral questions of should churches meet, or three questions. You could say, is it necessary? Is there something in Christian doctrine that says one has to meet physically every Sunday forever? Okay, and Christianity doesn't seem to me to rise and fall on whether or not they meet every Sunday. It is a hindrance to prayer, to worship, to corporate worship, to the taking of the sacraments if you're Catholic and not. It certainly is. But the question is, does a church have the ability to stop or start that without starting Christianity per se? Now, can the government step in to say, what are you going to do whether you decide to or not? And of course, in order to do that, according to the law, there needs to be a compelling state interest. Now, is that met? Well, with most churches, they've done it voluntarily because they see that it is a moral issue. You get the spiritual matters moral. They see that morally, they don't want their parishioners to be, or members to be infected with this. They recognize that people are dying from it. They don't want to be responsible for people's death. It is more important that their parishioners are healthy and living than it is that they meet, and thus they have followed this order voluntarily. Others have said, no, we're not. So here's where the legal question is. You got the moral question of whether or not it's moral to keep meeting and putting people in danger. But third, you got the legal issue of whether or not the government can stop it and whether or not you have a right to do so. Now, it seems to me the government has not necessarily been like storming the buildings, taking people out in cuffs. I think there's been some citations given and whatnot. My assumption is eventually some pastors are going to be issuing some apologies when some of their parishioners die. But the question is there a compelling state interest, and is the government doing this in the least restrictive way they can? Seems to me there's a compelling state interest in certain areas where the virus is very active. Maybe in Montana, where very few people, I don't even know if there are any cases in Montana yet, and if there are, it's not spreading like wildfire, because in Montana, they're very spread apart. Well, anyway, but that's a question here. This is a question for all of us, because this is a contemporary issue, and it takes the Sherbert test and the reevaluation of it, the reinstatement of it, I should say, with Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and we have to apply it to a situation today and ask, does the government actually have a compelling state interest, and are they acting in a reasonable way that is the least restrictive that they can? And so you ask yourself that question, is that the case?